Hi, here we are to talk about Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels. The first part of Gulliver's Travels, Book 1, is certainly the best known, where Gulliver travels to Lilliput where all the people are little, right? About 6 inches tall. Now, Swift himself, I don't know, we're kind of pushing along in the time frame, right? Born in 1667, so most of his adult life is spent in the 1700s. He was a friend of Alexander Pope. We'll be reading about him shortly as well. And other people of his time. Swift was a satirist, right? He wrote satires. Remember, when we talked about this already with Dryden, the point of a satire is to sort of point out problems, particularly problems in how people behave or they think, right? William Congreve's play The Way of the World was a satire, right? And like with Dryden in particular, right, McFlecknoe, Swift is writing a lot about his time, right? And some of the particulars do go to individuals of that time, and then you have to look at the footnotes to follow along. But I would argue that in the broad scope of what Jonathan Swift is addressing, there's a lot that's still true. Because he's talking about human nature. I mean, even when he's talking about politics, and there's a certain kind of political system in Great Britain, right, with a king and a parliament. And we don't have that in the United States. There's still a lot that still rings very, very true, right? Very true. So we got to be not so hung up, if you will, again, on the footnotes or worrying about who is what. Although, obviously, large scale, it's kind of nice to know some things. On the other hand, you could look at what's being said in Gulliver's Travels here and think, sounds really close to home still, right? Really close to home. And that's why I think it's such a popular story. Obviously, kids like it. It's seen by some people as a children's story because Gulliver, of course, goes to this land where people are little. And when you're a kid, you're always a little one. So wouldn't it be fun to have people who are really small you can boss around, right? Like poor kids get bossed around all the time, right? Now, when you read Gulliver's Travels, if you first of all, especially the first time you're reading it, right, there are the notes, a letter from Captain Gulliver to his cousin Simpson. And already, we're being drawn into this fiction, into this story, okay? And a lot of things don't make a whole lot of sense. And of course, they don't unless you read the whole novel. He mentions, for instance, the Houyhnhnms. Houyhnhnms are horses. In part 4, right, Gulliver travels to a land where horses are the intelligent creatures, and people, human beings, are yahoos. That's where the word Yahoo came from, actually. It's from this story, Swift. And so there's a complete inversion, right? Just like in McFlecknoe, Dryden inverts values, things which normally would be bad are considered good. By the end of Gulliver's Travels, Gulliver is seeing everything in a very misanthropic way, right? Meaning he doesn't like people anymore. Excuse me. And the character of Gulliver winds up hanging out in the stables with the horses, right? Unable to exist in human society because he cannot stand its flaws, right? even to the point where he can't even be around his own family. Right? So that's kind of what these first 3 pages sort of bring us to. Right? Now, once we move into the voyage to Lilliput, I want you to think of the name Gulliver. Gulliver is gullible, right? He takes everything in, and he accepts so many things without really questioning them. The action happens very, very quickly, where he's in a shipwreck pretty quickly and wanders off into the beach. He's exhausted, falls asleep on a golf course. No, it's not a golf course. But he says it's very short grass, right? Like a putting green is what I think of. And he wakes up, and we all know this story, this part of the story, right? He's tied down. And all these little people all around. Right? Now, one of the things I want you to think about, particularly with part 1, is how submissive Gulliver is. I mean, almost like right away. Now, on the one hand, you could conceivably argue that, he's tied down and they have the advantage, but they are only like 6 inches tall. And he could thrash about and kill a lot of them and probably eventually get out of the ties, the ropes that have him bound. I know he's bound by the hair too. Those of us with long hair would really hate that. But I mean, seriously, he could. He chooses not to. And that's an important point right from the beginning. Right? The submissive quality of Gulliver, and kind of suggesting in some ways the submissive quality of the character of the English person, the typical English person, who submits to higher authority, even when the authority is tiny, physically tiny, right? But it's still authority. And one of the things, notice how easily and quickly Gulliver recognizes the hierarchies of people all around him, because he's well trained as an English person to recognize these hierarchies, because they exist in English society, right? English government, but also English society in general. And so he sees the guy talking, right? He knows what he's saying, even though he doesn't know what he's literally saying. He recognizes the tone of voices, and also just for the expectation of what would you expect to have happen in such a circumstance. He wants to have food, and he's worried if he's being impolite, right? He's worried about being impolite. And then he has to urinate, and oh my gosh, the floodwater's open, right? And there's that business too. Which raises a question that I have in the discussion thread. So I don't want to talk about it too much here in the video, but the fact is, of course, Swift draws a lot of attention to things that are often not in stories, like the need to go to the bathroom, the need to eat, maybe even at inconvenient times or inconvenient situations, and so forth, right? Why? Think about that, right? It's something I want you to think about. He is basically drugged, as it turns out. Nice host, right? He is drugged with the wine that he is given. They cart him, right? They're very good engineers, and they cart him and chain him literally like a dog with a doghouse, right? I'm looking, for instance, on page 289, which is still here in chapter 2 of part 1. At the place where the carriage stopped, there stood an ancient temple esteemed to be the largest of the whole kingdom, which had been polluted some years before by an unnatural murder. And the footnote, of course, tells us this is likely referring to the murder of Charles I. Remember, we talked about that. who is murdered by the Puritans, right, who controlled Parliament. We talked about Cromwell and all that business. Swift is a conservative Church of England kind of guy, right? The dean, actually, within the Church of England. And so the Puritans and the extremeness, if you will, of the Puritans is offensive to him. Okay. But also, I want you to see Gulliver is chained like a dog to a doghouse. And the doghouse may look like Westminster Abbey, or Westminster Hall, excuse me, but it's still a doghouse. Okay, at least ostensibly, right? And then, of course, he has his bathroom issue at the beginning of the next section. And again, we have to talk about why, but we're not going to talk about that. You're going to talk about that. Now, one of the things that comes through pretty quickly is that Gulliver, in spite of, as I said, in spite of being 12 times the size of everybody, is very submissive. And he makes a show of mercy when some people kind of throw some stuff at him that they shouldn't, right? Kind of take some, shoot some arrows at him, pot shots, so to speak. And he acts like he's going to eat them up, like a big, angry giant, out of a fairy tale, right? Something like that from a folk tale. And then he shows them mercy, right? And of course, in doing so, right, he curries a lot of favor. Now, one of the things that comes through, especially in this part one, with the Lilliputians, there's tiny people, and they have kind of tiny minds. The way that they behave and the things that they do are tiny, small. And I mean that in a very negative way. Right? And you look at things that happen, right? So, for instance, how their politics are done. Right? Who advances? Rope dancing. Now, I'm not going to say we don't have rope dancing qualities in our own politics. That's something also that you might want to consider writing about, right? But at one point, they ask him to stand like a colossus with his legs spread apart and the army going underneath Gulliver, right, between his legs, right, kind of like a whole military parade. That's what it is, military parade. Now, he makes a joke about the quality of his pants being very worn and the young officers looking up to see his private parts, which what he assumes is admiration, 12 times the size. But it also, what does it show? On the more serious bend. Right? Who's in charge? It's a show of power, not by Gulliver, right? It's a show of power by the king, right? Now, one of the things I want you to think about also, there's a very funny bit when they're going through his pockets and they find the watch, which they kind of think of as God, right? Because they spend so much time. Time is so important, right? He doesn't do anything without consulting it. There are a lot of incidents, though, in part one that I want you to think about. There's as I said, the Colossus. There's also the conflict between the big Indians and little Indians, which is a spoof on Catholicism versus Protestantism. And the way that Swift puts it, it sounds very kind of not very important, right? The same thing with the high heels and low heels. Political differences to an outsider look very, very small. To them, they seem enormous, right? So when you talk about the bloody conflict between Catholics and Protestants, right, he reduces it down to which side of an egg to crack, right? Ultimately, of course, we know that Gulliver is triumphant in war against the Blefuscus, the Blefuscan navy, but the Lilliputians are greedy. They want more. He won't do it, so they want to kill him. That's not good. Okay, he doesn't want to die. so he escapes.